Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the Earth as it was tens of thousands of years ago. A world before great cities, before agriculture, before written language. Humanity was young then, scattered in small groups across Africa and parts of Asia, surviving by firelight, by stone tools, and by the fragile bonds of family and tribe. It was a time of deep uncertainty. The Ice Age was advancing. Massive sheets of ice crept across continents, locking away oceans, changing winds and seasons. To the south, forests teemed with life, but food was never guaranteed. Every hunt was uncertain. Every storm, every illness, every encounter with predators could be a turning point between survival and tragedy. And yet, despite these hardships, humanity endured. Fire was mastered. Tools sharpened. Language, in its earliest form, bound people together. Slowly, step by cautious step, our ancestors moved outward from Africa, curious, searching, surviving. But beneath the crust of the earth, forces were building. Invisible to the small bands of humans wandering the land, a colossus was stirring. It would become the greatest volcanic eruption in the last 2 million years. So great, in fact, that some scientists believe it very nearly erased our species from existence. This was the eruption of Toba, a supervolcano in what is now Sumatra, Indonesia. Around 74,000 years ago, it exploded with a violence that is almost beyond human comprehension. The story of Toba is not just a tale of geology. It is a story of survival, of fragility and resilience, of how close humanity may have come to disappearing, leaving only ash and silence behind. And it is also a story still wrapped in mystery. Did the eruption truly drive humanity to the edge of extinction? Or was its impact less severe, its memory preserved only in myth and scattered ash? In this journey, we will explore what the world was like before the eruption and what unfolded in its terrifying aftermath. We will move between science and story, between the quiet steps of early humans foraging on the plains and the roar of an earth that suddenly tore itself open. This introduction, then, is an invitation to settle into the long flow of history, to let the mind wander across landscapes both familiar and strange, and to listen, not just for facts, but for the echo of what it meant to be human in the shadow of fire. Imagine, for a moment, a small group of hunter-gatherers. They huddle around a fire in the cool night air of ancient Africa. The stars overhead are brilliant, untouched by city lights. Perhaps they tell stories of animals, of spirits, of journeys to come. In that moment, they do not know that far across the ocean, a mountain is gathering its strength. They cannot know that within a generation, the sky itself will change. This is how history often unfolds. Slowly, quietly, and then suddenly. A single event with the power to change everything. Supervolcanoes are unlike ordinary eruptions. They do not simply reshape a mountain or scatter ash across a valley. They can alter the global climate, darken the skies for years, and test the survival of entire species. Today, we measure such eruptions in terms of the volcanic explosivity index. On that scale, Toba's eruption is thought to have been a magnitude 8, the highest level. Thousands of times larger than the eruption of Mount Helens. 100 times more powerful than Krakatoa. Yet for all its violence, the eruption is remembered only through the traces it left behind, layers of ash hidden in the earth. Particles preserved in ice cores, far away in Greenland and Antarctica. And perhaps, in the faint genetic signatures that still ripple through humanity today. As you listen to this story, you may find yourself drifting between the known and the imagined, between science and survival, between the quiet persistence of small human communities and the overwhelming forces of geology. That is the balance of this tale, a calm exploration of catastrophe, a meditation on how close we came to vanishing and how astonishing it is that we did not. So tonight, as we begin, let the mind ease into that ancient world. A world where humans were not yet masters of the planet. A world where survival meant cooperation, courage, and luck. And a world where the earth itself could, without warning, unleash its fury on all who walked its surface. In the chapters to come, we will walk through that history. We will set the stage with the landscapes of 74,000 years ago. We will explore the eruption itself, its thunderous violence, its global reach. We will step into the lives of those who survived and consider what their days, their struggles, and their hopes may have been like. And finally, we will reflect on what this story means for us now, in an age where another supervolcano still sleeps beneath the earth. For now, take a slow breath. Let your mind drift across the millennia. The fire crackles. The stars wheel overhead. Humanity stands small, fragile, and unknowing. And deep within the earth, Toba waits. To understand the story of the Toba supervolcano, we must first travel back not just in miles, but in time. 74,000 years ago, the earth was a very different place. Vast, untamed, and wild. No borders. No empires. No cities rising above the land. Only landscapes shaped by wind, ice, fire, and the slow march of evolution. The world of the late Pleistocene was caught in the rhythm of an ice age. Great sheets of frozen water stretched down from the poles, locking away the oceans. Sea levels were lower, exposing land bridges that connected islands and continents. What is now the shallow sea between Asia and Australia was, in that time, dry ground. People and animals could cross where today only water lies. The climate itself was harsh and unpredictable. In some regions, dry winds swept across grasslands, while elsewhere dense forests thrived. Animals that are now extinct roamed freely, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. Their presence shaped the lives of humans, both as threats and as sources of food and material. And humanity? We were few in number. Our species, Homo sapiens, had emerged in Africa not long before. Small groups of people lived as hunter-gatherers, traveling light, following the seasons, the migrations of animals, and the cycles of fruit and plant growth. Stone tools clinked in careful hands. Spears were sharpened by firelight. These groups were not large. Perhaps a few dozen people at most, bound together by blood and trust. Children grew up learning to read the land, the tracks of animals in the dirt, the whisper of birds overhead, the taste of plants that healed and those that poisoned. Survival was a constant lesson. Farther north, other kinds of humans walked the earth. Neanderthals thrived in Europe and Western Asia, strong and resourceful, perfectly adapted to the cold. Denisovans, a mysterious cousin species, lived somewhere in Asia, though we know them now only through faint traces in DNA and a handful of fossils. The world was not yet ours alone. It was shared, diverse, and uncertain. The lands around what is now Indonesia were lush and full of life. Tropical forests blanketed the islands. Rivers wound through valleys, rich with fish and birds. To the south, Early humans had already begun their great journey, crossing into Australia tens of thousands of years before the eruption. They carried fire and stories with them, leaving footprints on beaches that still exist today. But for all its richness, the earth was fragile. The climate swung like a pendulum, from warmer interludes to colder spells. A sudden drought or freeze could mean famine. Populations rose and fell. At this time, it is believed that perhaps only a few 100,000 humans existed across the entire planet, fewer than the population of a single modern city. Imagine, then, this world. A family sits near a fire on the edge of a savanna. Beyond them, herds of antelope drift across the horizon. The air is alive with insects, the calls of distant birds. At night, the stars blaze in ways few of us today have ever seen, unchallenged by smoke or artificial light. The Milky Way stretches bright across the heavens, and the people look upward, perhaps with wonder, perhaps with stories. They do not yet know the sciences of the skies, but they feel their mystery deeply. Now imagine another scene, far away in the north. The wind howls across open tundra, where Neanderthals take shelter in caves. Their fires sputter in the draft, their children wrapped in furs. They hunt mammoth and reindeer, carving tools from bone and ivory. Their world is cold, yet they endure. This was Earth at the time of the Toba supervolcano, a patchwork of climates, peoples, and creatures. And though the world seemed eternal, beneath it lay forces far greater than any tribe could imagine. The very crust of the earth is restless. Tectonic plates shift and collide. Magma wells up beneath weak points, building pressure for thousands of years. These processes are silent, invisible to the humans who lived above them. But they are patient. They wait. The island of Sumatra, where Toba lies today, was already shaped by the collision of massive tectonic plates. It sat in the fiery ring of fire, a zone of earthquakes and volcanoes that still shakes the earth today. Beneath its jungles, a vast chamber of molten rock was gathering. Its pressure grew century by century, millennia by millennia, until it could no longer be contained. But to the people alive then, there was no hint. No sign that their world was about to change. For them, life went on in its fragile rhythm, waking at dawn, searching for food, keeping watch against predators, singing or murmuring stories by night. Their concerns were immediate hunger, cold, safety. The idea of the earth itself erupting on a scale so vast would have been unthinkable. This is one of the great contrasts of the Toba story, the immense, slow, geological forces beneath the surface, and the delicate, moment-to-moment lives of the humans above. Humanity, small and scattered, unaware that within their own lifetimes, the skies might turn dark. And so, as we stand at this threshold in the story, we see Earth in its fullness, rich and dangerous, harsh and beautiful. A planet alive with movement, with ice and fire, with creatures large and small, and with humans just beginning their long journey. It is against this backdrop, this fragile balance of life and survival, that the Great Eruption came. A single event that would transform landscapes, alter climates, and perhaps nearly end the human story before it had truly begun. If we were to travel to the island of Sumatra today, we would find a vast lake, quiet and still, stretching across more than 100 kilometers. Its waters shimmer under the tropical sun. Fishermen cast their nets. Villages dot the shores, their lives woven into the rhythm of the lake. At first glance, it appears peaceful, almost timeless. But this lake is no ordinary lake. It is a scar, the great wound left behind by one of the most powerful eruptions in Earth's history. This is Lake Toba, a caldera, a basin formed when a volcano empties itself in a catastrophic explosion and the land above collapses. Beneath its waters lies the memory of a disaster so immense that it shaped the course of our species. To understand Toba, we must first understand what a supervolcano truly is. Ordinary volcanoes, like Mount Fuji or Mount Vesuvius, erupt with destructive force, yet their scale is limited to a region or continent. A supervolcano is something else entirely. It is defined not by the height of its peak, but by the size of its eruption, an explosion capable of releasing more than 1,000 cubic kilometers of volcanic material in a single event. That is a number almost too vast to imagine. Picture billions upon billions of tons of ash, rock, and molten lava hurled skyward, reaching the stratosphere and beyond. Toba was one such supervolcano. Hidden beneath the lush forests of ancient Sumatra, a massive chamber of magma grew for tens of thousands of years. Magma is molten rock, filled with gases under tremendous pressure. As this chamber expanded, the crust above it strained, like a drum stretched to its breaking point. Geologists describe it as a time bomb of the Earth, one that ticks silently, unseen, until it reaches a critical threshold. When the pressure becomes greater than the strength of the rock above, the result is not a gentle eruption, but a cataclysm. We can only imagine what signs the Earth gave in the years before Toba's final outburst. Perhaps the ground trembled with earthquakes. Perhaps plumes of gas escaped through fissures, warning of the growing pressure below. To the people and animals living there, these would have been strange, frightening events, but the true danger would have remained beyond comprehension. Modern science helps us reconstruct this ancient event. Deep beneath the sediments of Lake Toba, cores reveal layers of volcanic rock, thick deposits of ignimbrite, formed by the flows of superheated ash. These rocks tell us that the eruption was not a brief burst but a prolonged catastrophe. Estimates suggest that as much as 2,800 cubic kilometers of material were expelled. That is enough to bury entire countries in ash, to blanket continents in darkness. When the magma chamber emptied, the land above it collapsed. Imagine an entire mountain range suddenly sinking inward, leaving behind a hole so vast that it later filled with water to become the lake we see today. This collapse alone was a world-shaking event, producing earthquakes that would have been felt thousands of kilometers away. To grasp the scale, it helps to compare. In 1980, Mount St. Helens erupted in the United States, releasing about 1 cubic kilometer of material. It devastated forests, flattened landscapes, and darkened skies for days. Toba's eruption was nearly 3,000 times larger. Krakatoa, the famous Indonesian eruption of 1883 that produced tsunamis and global sunsets, released about 25 cubic kilometers of ash and rock. Toba dwarfed it more than 100 times over. This was not simply a local disaster. It was planetary. The eruption would have produced pyroclastic flows, avalanches of ash, rock, and gas moving faster than any creature could run, hotter than any fire a human could make. These flows could travel hundreds of kilometers, incinerating forests, rivers, and valleys. Everything in their path would have been erased. Above, a towering column of ash rose into the stratosphere, higher than any storm cloud. Lightning crackled within it, generated by the friction of particles colliding. As the column collapsed, it spread a choking cloud of ash across South Asia, the Indian Ocean, and far beyond. Even today, We find evidence of this ash in India, in the Arabian Sea, in sediments thousands of kilometers away. And then came the gases, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and others, launched into the atmosphere in staggering quantities. These gases formed tiny droplets that reflected sunlight back into space. The Earth's surface began to cool. What had started as a roar of fire would become a winter of darkness. For the people alive in those days, the eruption itself must have been beyond terror. Imagine standing on a distant ridge and seeing the sky boil with fire. Imagine the air filled with ash so thick it turned day into night. Imagine the rumble beneath the feet, the rain of hot rock, the collapse of forests, the silence after everything familiar was gone. And yet, most humans alive then never saw Toba directly. They were far away, scattered across Africa, Asia, and perhaps even beyond. For them, the disaster came not as fire, but as hunger and cold. In the months and years after the eruption, the gases and ash circled the globe. The sun dimmed. Rains failed. Crops withered. Animals vanished. This was the legacy of Toba, a catastrophe that reached far beyond its source, touching the entire planet. Today, Lake Toba rests quietly. Tourists come to its shores, unaware that beneath their feet lies the remnant of a sleeping giant. Geologists keep watch, for although Toba has erupted in smaller ways since, its greatest fury may yet awaken again in the far future. But 74,000 years ago, it was not quite. It was the beating heart of destruction, the furnace that would test whether humanity could endure. And so, as we leave this section of the story, we hold two images in our mind. One is the calm lake of the present, its waters reflecting the sky, its villages thriving on the shores. The other is the roaring void of the past, when the earth tore itself apart and nearly carried humanity with it. The earth had been building toward this moment for thousands of years. Deep below the surface of ancient Sumatra, pressure mounted silently, steadily, like water swelling behind a fragile dam. Then, in one final instant, the balance gave way. The eruption of Toba began with a thunder that no human ear had ever heard before. It was a sound deeper than storm or earthquake, a roar that rolled across mountains and seas. The ground heaved. Rivers trembled. Animals bolted in every direction, confused and terrified. Imagine standing on a distant plain, hundreds of kilometers away. You would not see the volcano itself, but you might see the horizon glow red. The air would shudder as waves of pressure pulsed outward. Trees swayed though no wind was present. The very earth seemed to breathe, groaning under the weight of the blast. At the center, where the mountain once stood, the eruption was apocalyptic. A column of ash, rock, and fire blasted upward with unimaginable force. It climbed higher than thunderheads, higher than Everest, piercing the stratosphere. Lightning erupted within the column, jagged veins of light crackling through the darkness as static built from countless particles colliding in the storm. The ash did not rise gently. It surged like a living thing. Within minutes, the sky darkened. Day became night. And beneath that suffocating canopy, waves of destruction rolled outward. The first of these were pyroclastic flows, avalanches of molten rock fragments, ash, and toxic gas. They traveled at speeds faster than a cheetah, hotter than the flames of a bonfire. Entire forests vanished in moments, swallowed by rivers of fire and ash. Valleys filled, rivers boiled, and plains were smothered beneath layers of searing debris. Those flows spread for hundreds of kilometers. Imagine a sheet of destruction covering the land, leaving nothing living behind. Not tree, not animal, not human could withstand their heat and speed. But the eruption was not a single burst. It unfolded in phases, each one more devastating than the last. After the first surge of magma and ash, more pressure built, forcing itself upward in renewed explosions. Some scientists believe the eruption may have lasted days or even weeks, a prolonged catastrophe rather than a single moment of violence. And as the eruption continued, the ash spread farther and farther. Particles finer than dust rose into the upper atmosphere. Winds carried them across South Asia, over the Indian Ocean, and into the skies of Africa. The air itself became a carrier of disaster. For those who lived thousands of kilometers away, the effects would not have been instant death, but a creeping darkness. Imagine waking to a sky tinted red, the sun dimmed behind a veil of ash. Birds silent. The air carrying the acrid scent of sulfur. Then, over days, the light fading further, until even at midday the world felt like twilight. Rain would have fallen, not clear and life-giving, but dark and bitter, laced with ash. Rivers turned grey. Plants wilted under the weight of toxic dust. The temperature began to fall, a slow chill that settled into the bones of the earth. This was the beginning of what scientists call a volcanic winter. When enough ash and sulfur enter the atmosphere, they block the sun's warmth, reflecting it back into space. For years after Toba's eruption, the world may have been several degrees colder on average. That small number, a mere 2 or 3 degrees, was enough to alter rainfall patterns, shorten growing seasons, and tip fragile ecosystems into collapse. But let us return, for a moment, to those who may have witnessed the eruption directly. Picture a small band of humans living on the fringes of the Indian Ocean. They hunt, they gather, they sleep beneath the stars. And then, one morning, the horizon blooms with fire. Ash begins to fall like snow. The air grows hard to breathe. They cover their faces, trying to protect their lungs. The ground trembles beneath their feet, again and again, as the earth convulses. For them, there is no explanation. Only terror. Many such groups may have been wiped out entirely. Yet others, far away in Africa or sheltered in isolated regions, survived. For them, the eruption's memory may have endured as story or myth, carried forward in whispers of a time when the sun disappeared, when the sky turned black, when the earth itself seemed to rage. The geological record supports this vision of devastation. Across India, scientists have discovered layers of volcanic ash meters thick, blanketing the soil. In ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica, they find tiny shards of glass, microscopic particles ejected from Toba, carried across hemispheres. These frozen records mark the eruption like scars, proof of a global event. And yet, the most haunting evidence may not lie in rock or ice, but in ourselves. For when geneticists study the history of humanity, they find a strange pattern. Around 70 to 80,000 years ago, our species seems to have passed through a bottleneck. Genetic diversity shrinks, as though the population of humans worldwide dwindled to just a few thousand. Was Toba the cause? Did this eruption, this single act of geologic fury, nearly erase us from existence? The debate continues. Some argue that the bottleneck was real and linked directly to the eruption. Others believe it may have been less severe, that humanity weathered the storm better than once thought. But either way, the eruption's shadow falls across our history. It is sobering to think that our existence today, every civilization and invention, every language and story, may rest on the fragile survival of those few who endured the darkness after Toba. When the eruption finally ceased, the mountain was gone. In its place lay a vast, empty caldera, silent and broken. The fires dimmed. The ash settled. The earth grew quiet again, though the world it had left behind was transformed. The day the sky went dark was not just a day, but the beginning of years of hardship, hunger, and uncertainty. Yet it was also the beginning of a test of whether humanity could survive the fury of the planet itself. And survive we did. Scarred, reduced, but not erased. The memory of that darkened sky lingers in the rocks, in the ice, and perhaps in the resilience that carried us forward. When the roar of the earth had finally fallen silent, when the fire and thunder of the eruption had faded, what remained was not peace, but silence of another kind. A heavy, uneasy silence, as though the world itself had paused. The great eruption of Toba was over, yet its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Above the shattered caldera, where an entire mountain had collapsed into itself, ash still drifted upward in ghostly plumes. But the true story of the aftermath was being written in the skies, thousands of meters above the earth. Billions of tons of volcanic ash and sulfur gases had risen into the atmosphere. The smallest particles, lighter than dust, did not fall back quickly. Instead, they spread into a veil that circled the planet. The skies grew hazy. Sunlight, once brilliant and life-giving, became muted, pale, and weak. This was the birth of a volcanic winter. For people alive at the time, the change may have seemed gradual, creeping into daily life. Perhaps they noticed that mornings grew colder, that plants sprouted late and withered early, that rains came in strange patterns, sometimes failing altogether. Imagine walking through a forest where leaves droop under the weight of grey ash. Streams run cloudy, fish gasping in the poisoned water. The air itself tastes bitter, each breath carrying fine particles that sting the throat. To find food in such a world would be a daily struggle. The cooling that followed Toba's eruption is believed to have lowered global temperatures by several degrees Celsius. In our modern world, a drop of just 1 or 2 degrees can cause massive disruptions to agriculture and weather. For the fragile ecosystems of 74,000 years ago, even a small shift was devastating. Grasslands shrank. Forests thinned. Animals that people depended on for food grew scarce, their migrations disrupted. Across Africa, Asia, and beyond, groups of early humans faced the same grim challenge: how to endure in a world where the sun no longer shone as before. The skies themselves must have been airy. Instead of clear blues and golden dawns, people would have looked up to see a ceiling of dim, smoky light. Sunsets may have glowed red and orange, painted by ash, but their beauty would have been overshadowed by hunger and fear. Nights, already long, grew colder. Fires were guarded carefully, treasured as shields against the encroaching chill. In this darkened world, daily survival became a test of resilience. Families and tribes would have gathered more tightly, pooling their knowledge and resources. Cooperation was not a choice, but a necessity. One skilled at finding roots and tubers. Another adept at tracking weakened animals. Another keeping the fires alive through wind and storm. Together, they stood a chance. Alone, few could survive. The ashfall itself created another barrier. In some regions, it blanketed the ground in layers meters thick. Seeds could not germinate. Rivers were clogged. Grazing animals perished when their food supply vanished. Those who lived in or near these zones may not have survived at all. Only those on the edges, or far away in Africa and more sheltered places, could endure. Scientists have found traces of this ash across the Indian subcontinent, a silent map of devastation. In places, the soil is sealed beneath a grey layer, marking the months and years when the earth was suffocated under the fallout of Toba. But perhaps the greatest challenge was not only hunger but time. The volcanic winter did not pass in weeks or months. Its grip may have lasted for years, even decades. Each new generation was born into scarcity, raised in a world where food was never certain and warmth was fleeting. For early humans, this may have been a crucible. Those who adapted, who learned to conserve, to migrate, to share, passed on their ways. Those who could not, vanished. The eruption was not merely an event of destruction, but a filter, shaping who we became. And yet, amid this bleakness, there were moments of quiet resilience. Picture a child, growing up in this dimmed world, learning to laugh despite the hunger. Picture families gathering at night, telling stories around the fire, stories perhaps about the sky, about the spirits of the earth, about why the sun had gone away. In these stories, memory was preserved. The catastrophe may have become myth, carried forward long after the ash had settled. Some scientists even wonder if the hardships of this time sparked innovation. Scarcity forces creativity. In a world where food was hard to find, perhaps humans became better hunters, more skilled foragers, more inventive toolmakers. Perhaps it was in this long shadow of Toba that our species developed strengths that later carried us across continents. Still, the suffering must have been immense. Archaeological evidence suggests declines in population. Genetic studies hint that humanity may have been reduced to a small remnant, a bottleneck in our history. While the numbers are debated, the image remains, a world where survival was uncertain and extinction loomed close. The volcanic winter was not eternal. Slowly, over years and decades, the atmosphere cleared. Ash settled into oceans, soils, and ice. The sun returned, though the earth remained cold for generations. Forests grew back. Rivers ran clear again. Animals repopulated the plains. Life, as always, found a way forward. And so did humans. Those who endured the long winter carried with them not just survival, but memory. Memory of a world turned dark, of hardship and resilience. Memory, perhaps, of the day the earth itself had seemed to try to erase them. When we look back now, across 74,000 years, we see not only the devastation, but the astonishing fact that our ancestors survived at all. The volcanic winter of Toba tested the very limits of humanity, and we emerged, fragile but unbroken. The great eruption of Toba did not simply scar the land. It scarred humanity itself. In the centuries that followed, the world grew colder, harsher, and more uncertain. The volcanic winter had settled over the earth, and for the small, scattered groups of humans alive at the time, the future must have seemed impossibly fragile. Scientists today speak of something called a genetic bottleneck. It is the idea that, at some point in the past, the population of our species shrank to a fraction of its earlier size, perhaps to only a few thousand individuals worldwide. Imagine that for a moment. All of humanity, reduced to numbers smaller than the crowd at a modern football stadium. Every person alive today, every culture and language and nation, descending from that small, fragile remnant. It is a humbling thought that our survival once hung by such a thin thread. The evidence comes not from stone tools or bones, but from our DNA. When scientists map genetic variation across the world, they find patterns that suggest a sharp reduction in diversity around 70 to 80,000 years ago. It is as though a wide river of humanity narrowed suddenly into a trickling stream before widening again in the millennia that followed. The Toba eruption is one possible explanation for this event. The ash clouds, the cooling, the famine all may have conspired to push our species to the very edge. But what would that have felt like for those who lived through it? Life in the bottleneck would have been stripped to its essentials. Food was scarce, animals harder to track, plants harder to find. Families and small tribes depended utterly on one another. Cooperation was not merely helpful, it was the only way to endure. A hunter who found a small animal shared the meat, for tomorrow it might be someone else's turn to bring back food. A gatherer who found roots or berries could not afford to hoard them. In the bottleneck, selfishness meant extinction. Fire became a treasure beyond measure. In the cold nights of the volcanic winter, a flame was not only warmth, but protection and hope. Children would have slept close to it, elders guarding the embers through the long dark. Losing a fire meant risking death, so every group knew how to carry it, how to coax it back to life from a bed of coals. Around those fires, stories must have been told. Stories to explain the darkness, to comfort the fearful, to remind each other that they were not alone. The landscapes themselves bore little mercy. In places closest to the eruption, ash covered the ground so thickly that little could grow. Rivers ran foul. Herds of animals moved away or died outright. People there would have had no choice but to leave, to wander farther than before, seeking lands untouched by the suffocating grey blanket. Migration was not adventure, it was survival. Yet even migration was perilous. Strangers met on the trail might be kin, or they might be rivals for the same dwindling resources. Tensions flared. But there was also intermingling, the exchange of skills, the mixing of families. In such moments, humanity found ways to endure together. Some scientists believe it was in times like these that new networks of cooperation and language began to flourish, the seeds of culture planted in hardship. We can imagine the silence of those years. Forests thinned. Birds quieted. The once abundant world felt empty. For the small bands of humans who persisted, each day was a test. Wake with the dawn. Search for signs of animals. Dig for roots beneath the ash. Keep the children fed. Keep the fire alive. Keep moving. Always moving. Yet there was resilience too. People adapted. They learned which plants survived despite the dim light. They discovered that tubers hidden deep in the ground could sustain them when berries failed. They followed rivers that still ran clean, fishing when hunting grew too lean. Their tools became sharper, more efficient, their strategies more cunning. In scarcity, they innovated. In hardship, they learned. The genetic bottleneck, if it truly happened, is both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Terrifying because our species came so close to vanishing. Awe-inspiring because we did not. Somewhere, in caves, in forests, on coastlines, small groups endured. And from them came us all. It is possible that in those days, some bands of humans looked at the dimmed sun and believed the world was ending. Perhaps they told their children stories that the sky had angered the spirits, or that the earth itself was dying. And yet, those children grew, survived, and carried their own children forward. What feels like an ending in the long arc of history was in fact a beginning. In Africa, where the effects of the eruption may have been less severe, human groups continued to thrive, though under harsher skies. From there, new waves of migration eventually spread outward again, filling Asia, Europe, and beyond. The bottleneck did not stop the human journey, it shaped it. It may even be that this crucible of survival gave humanity certain qualities that remain with us today. The ability to adapt quickly. The instinct to cooperate in times of crisis. The imagination to create tools, language, and stories that help us endure. In the shadow of near extinction, we became, paradoxically, stronger. When we think of our species now, billions of people across every continent, satellites in the sky, cities of light, it is almost impossible to imagine that all of this traces back to a time when perhaps only a few thousand individuals walked the earth. Yet it is so. Each of us is a thread in that long, fragile cord of survival. The Toba eruption tested humanity in ways we can scarcely comprehend. And in the long silence after the skies grew dark, the human bottleneck became a passage, a narrowing through which our entire species was forced to pass. Those who made it through carried the spark forward, the spark that would one day light the fires of civilization. The years following the Toba eruption were unlike anything humanity had ever known. Life continued, but it was no longer the same life that had existed before the ash clouds spread across the sky. Every tsunamis carried with it a dull light, pale and cold, filtered through the lingering veil of particles that circled the earth. For those alive then, mornings must have felt strange, the sun weakened, the world quieter, the air colder. To live in the shadow of ash was to live in constant adaptation, every day a search for balance between survival and exhaustion. The land itself was transformed. In some regions, the once fertile soil was buried under layers of ash. Rivers, choked with debris, shifted their courses, leaving behind stagnant pools and marshes. Forests thinned, grasses yellowed, and the great herds of animals that people had relied on began to scatter or vanish. Hunters, once skilled at following predictable migrations, now faced uncertainty. Tracks that had always led to food grew faint, and the animals themselves were weakened by the scarcity of vegetation. To eat, humans had to think differently, search harder, and sometimes settle for less. Foragers, too, faced challenges unknown to their ancestors. The plants that had long sustained communities were no longer reliable. Seeds did not sprout. Fruits withered before ripening. Those who had once gathered nuts and berries now turned to hidden roots and tubers buried deep in the soil, plants tough enough to endure when others failed. These were hard to find and harder to prepare, but necessity taught people persistence. Slowly, knowledge spread within small groups, which roots were edible, which plants held hidden nourishment, which should never be touched. Daily life would have felt fragile, a constant negotiation with hunger. Families woke each morning not knowing if the day's search would bring food or empty hands. Children cried with hunger, elders grew weaker, and yet the human instinct to endure carried people forward. They built shelters more carefully, lined with ash or mud to keep out the cold winds. Fires were placed at the heart of these shelters, their smoke rising into the grey skies, small signals of warmth in a world that seemed endlessly cold. And yet, even in this dimmed existence, there must have been moments of quiet beauty. The skies, though strange, would sometimes glow with colors more vivid than before. Ash and dust refracted the sunlight, painting dawns and dusks with deep reds and oranges. Perhaps people paused to watch these skies, wondering what they meant, weaving them into their stories and beliefs. To them, the world was alive with mystery. Each unusual glow, each shift in the winds, was a sign, perhaps of danger, perhaps of hope. Water became another daily struggle. Ashfall polluted streams and lakes, leaving them bitter or clogged. People had to travel farther to find clean sources, sometimes digging into the earth itself to uncover fresh water. In coastal areas, where the sea still teemed with life, humans turned increasingly to fishing, crafting sharper tools and new techniques to harvest from the waves. Shellfish, small fish, and sea plants may have become vital sources of sustenance when the land could no longer be trusted. Life in the shadow of ash was not only about food and water. It was about endurance of spirit. Communities needed to remain together, for separation meant weakness. At night, groups gathered around their fires, huddling close not only for warmth but for comfort. In the flicker of flames, stories were told, stories that explained why the sun had dimmed, why the animals had gone, why the earth trembled with fire. Myths grew, passed from parent to child, binding people through shared meaning in a world of confusion. These stories may have been the seeds of deeper cultural traditions, a way to transform hardship into understanding. It is easy to imagine the rhythm of such a life. Morning begins with the search for food. Adults move quietly through the grey forests, children trailing behind, learning by watching. The sound of footsteps in ash, the crack of dry branches, the occasional distant call of an animal, this was the music of survival. By midday, the search may have led to small successes, a hidden route, a weak animal caught in a trap, fish speared in shallow water. By evening, families returned, gathering what little they had found, cooking it carefully over the fire, each bite shared equally. The night brought its own challenges. With the skies so often veiled, stars were dim, and the world was cloaked in a deeper darkness than before. The cold pressed in from every side, and the fire became more than warmth, it was life itself. The glow of the flames cast shadows on the walls of shelters, and in those shadows, people must have dreamed of better days, remembering the world as it once was, hoping it might return again. Over time, people adapted. They developed new tools for digging, new weapons for hunting smaller, quicker animals, new ways of preserving fire in ash-covered landscapes. Even the ash itself, once only a curse, may have found uses as a way to insulate shelters, to preserve food, or to mark trails across shifting terrain. Slowly, knowledge accumulated, born from necessity, passed along as precious wisdom. To live in the shadow of ash was to live on the edge of survival, but it was also to witness the resilience of humanity. People did not simply endure, they transformed. The hardships pressed them into closer bonds, sharpened their skills, deepened their traditions. What seemed at first like an ending became, in the long story of our species, a chapter of growth. Though the skies remained grey for years, and though generations may have passed before the earth truly healed, life went on. The fires were kept alive. The stories were remembered. Children grew into adults, carrying the knowledge of their parents, teaching it again to their own children. The shadow of ash did not break humanity. It shaped it. And in that shaping, our ancestors laid the foundations for the future to come. Tens of thousands of years have passed since the great eruption of Toba, yet traces of it may linger in ways that are not measured in ash or stone, but in story. Human beings are storytellers by nature, and when faced with mystery or disaster, we weave explanations that can be carried across generations. Myths and legends, often cloaked in symbolism, are sometimes the only records of ancient events that lived on in memory long after the people who first witnessed them were gone. It is possible that the Toba catastrophe, or echoes of similar eruptions, left impressions in the oldest traditions of humanity. Scattered across the world are tales of skies darkening, of endless winters, of times when the sun refused to shine. Some speak of great floods that followed, of gods angry with humankind, of punishments from the heavens. These myths may not be literal memories, but they resonate with themes that align uncannily with what we know about volcanic winters. Imagine small groups of survivors, gathered around fires during the long nights of ash and cold. The children, frightened by the dim sun, would ask their elders why the world had changed. And the elders, struggling to explain, would tell stories of a sky swallowed by smoke, of mountains that breathed fire, of spirits demanding sacrifice or reverence. In those stories, truth was wrapped in metaphor, but the memory endured. Generations later, when the skies had cleared and the world had begun to heal, those stories continued to be told. They may have shifted in detail, adapted to new landscapes, shaped by new cultures, but their core remained: the earth could be wrathful, the heavens could darken, life could be tested by powers beyond human control. Such stories would have served not only as memory but as warning, a way of teaching children that survival was never guaranteed, that respect for nature was essential. In many cultures, even today, there are flood myths, tales of destruction followed by renewal. While most are tied to rising waters, some begin with fire and smoke, with the heavens dimmed before the rains fell. These myths may echo volcanic events, not only Toba, but others that scarred human history. The eruption of Mount Toba in North America, the explosion of Santorini in the Aegean, the destruction wrought by Krakatoa and Tambora in more recent centuries, each inspired legends and oral traditions among the people who lived through them. If these later events left such marks on culture, it is not hard to imagine that Toba did as well, even if in ways now faint and hidden. There is something deeply human about this process. Where written records fail, memory transforms into myth. Where detail is lost, meaning is preserved. The people who survived Toba may not have understood the geological forces at work, but they understood suffering, and they understood the need to remember. And so, the stories continued. Perhaps a myth told of a sky that fell asleep, refusing to wake for many seasons. Perhaps another spoke of a great beast in the mountain, whose roar covered the world in ash. Or perhaps they told of a god who struck the earth in anger, demanding humility from mortals. However they were told, such myths carried the weight of experience, turning hardship into lesson. Modern researchers sometimes look at these myths with fresh eyes, asking whether behind the poetry lies a memory of real events. The similarities across cultures, dark skies, endless winters, floods, fires, may be coincidence, or they may be the fingerprints of ancient catastrophes passed down through countless generations. For a species that nearly vanished, to remember through story was another form of survival. Even now, when we read or listen to ancient myths, we may be hearing faint whispers from those who once lived in the shadow of Toba. Their voices, softened by time, reach us through allegory and legend. They remind us that our ancestors were not only survivors, but storytellers, carrying forward both knowledge and meaning. And perhaps this is the deepest echo of all. The eruption of Toba was not remembered in stone tablets or inscriptions. It was remembered in people, in their genes, in their resilience, in their myths. In every culture that warns of darkness, that speaks of fire from the earth, that recalls the fragility of life beneath the sky, there may be a trace of that ancient disaster. Not precise, not literal, but powerful all the same. The echoes of myth and memory bind us to those who came before. They remind us that we are part of a chain stretching back through the millennia, linked by both suffering and story. The world changed, humanity was tested, and yet, through story, the memory of that test was carried forward. Even as the ash settled, the tale lived on. The word supervolcano may sound like something out of myth, yet it is a scientific reality, one of the most powerful natural forces on Earth, capable of reshaping entire continents and altering the climate of the planet itself. To understand the Toba eruption, and why it was so devastating, we need to step back and look at the science of these giants, the hidden machinery of the Earth that makes such colossal events possible. Beneath the ground we walk on lies a restless world. The Earth's crust, though solid to us, is only a thin shell compared to what lies beneath. Underneath, in the mantle, immense heat churns slowly over millions of years, driving molten rock upward. Sometimes this molten rock, or magma, finds cracks and weaknesses, pushing toward the surface. Usually, this results in ordinary volcanoes, the kinds that rise into sharp peaks or broad mountains, venting lava in smaller eruptions. But sometimes, in rare places, the magma does not simply rise through one vent. Instead, it gathers in vast chambers, stretching for miles, hidden deep beneath the crust. When the pressure in these chambers builds beyond the strength of the rock above, the result is a supervolcano. Unlike normal volcanoes, a supervolcano does not always announce itself with a towering mountain. Instead, its eruptions are so powerful that they can collapse the ground itself, leaving behind giant depressions known as calderas. These can span dozens of kilometers, scars so vast they can only be seen clearly from the air. Toba, in Sumatra, is one such caldera. Today, it is filled with the waters of Lake Toba, a serene reminder of the cataclysm that shaped it. When a supervolcano erupts, it is not simply lava that poses the greatest danger. It is the sheer volume of material thrown into the sky. Toba is believed to have ejected nearly 3,000 cubic kilometers of ash, rock, and gas. To put that in perspective, the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens in the United States released less than 1 cubic kilometer. Even Tambora, in 1815, the eruption that caused the year without a summer, released about 160 cubic kilometers. Toba was nearly 20 times larger. The scale is so vast that ordinary numbers begin to lose their meaning. The ash from such eruptions can travel thousands of kilometers, carried by winds high in the atmosphere. Fine particles linger, blocking and scattering sunlight, while sulfur dioxide and other gases react to form aerosols that reflect even more heat away from the Earth. This is why supervolcanoes have the power not just to devastate local landscapes, but to change the global climate for years, or even decades. Scientists studying ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica have found chemical traces of ancient eruptions, locked in layers of ice that preserve a record of the atmosphere. These clues, alongside layers of ash found in soils across India and Southeast Asia, help reconstruct the reach of Toba's eruption. Together, they paint a picture of a planet dimmed, cooled, and unsettled by the event. But the science of supervolcanoes is not only about the past. Today, Researchers study other calderas that could, one day, produce eruptions on a similar scale. Yellowstone, in North America, is one of the most well-known examples. Beneath its peaceful geysers and hot springs lies a vast magma chamber. Its past eruptions, though separated by hundreds of thousands of years, were immense, rivaling Toba in power. Campi Flegrei in Italy, Topo in New Zealand, and other calderas around the world remind us that supervolcanoes are not just relics of ancient history, they are still part of the living Earth. Yet it is important to remember that supervolcano eruptions are exceedingly rare. While they hold the power to disrupt entire civilizations, they do not occur often on the timescales of human history. Toba, Yellowstone, and others erupt not in centuries, but in intervals of hundreds of thousands of years. The Earth works slowly, and though the possibility remains, the likelihood of seeing such an eruption in our lifetime is very small. Still, the study of supervolcanoes matters deeply, not only to understand our past but to prepare for the future. Scientists monitor seismic activity, ground deformation, and gas emissions in places like Yellowstone, searching for signs of changes in the magma systems below. Satellite imaging helps track shifts in the Earth's surface, subtle bulges or subsidence that may reveal the movements of magma deep underground. While we cannot prevent such eruptions, knowledge can help us prepare, mitigate, and understand their impact. There is a strange beauty in this science. The very forces that bring devastation are also part of what makes Earth a living planet. Without volcanoes, the Earth's surface would not be replenished. Minerals would not rise from the deep. Many landscapes we cherish today, fertile soils, volcanic islands, mountain ranges exist because of this restless engine beneath our feet. Supervolcanoes are an extreme expression of this same process, a reminder that the Earth is not static but alive, in its own slow and powerful rhythm. For those who look back at Toba, the science provides both answers and wonder. It tells us how the eruption unfolded, why the skies dimmed, why our ancestors struggled. But it also invites us to reflect on the scale of our planet. To think of a blast that could dim the sun across the globe is to confront forces beyond human comprehension. And yet, humanity endured. Perhaps that is the balance of the story. Science gives us understanding, while history gives us perspective. We know the chemistry of ash, the physics of aerosols, the timelines of eruptions. But we also know that people, fragile as they were, survived through it. The science of supervolcanoes reveals the power of the Earth and the resilience of those who live upon it. In this way, the story of Toba is both geological and human. It is the story of rocks and magma, of gases and ash. But it is also the story of families huddled around fires, of children born in the cold years, of ancestors who carried forward the spark of life when it could so easily have gone out. The Earth reshaped itself in fire, and humanity, small as it was, walked through the shadow and endured. When we look back at the eruption of Toba, 74,000 years ago, it can feel like a distant and almost mythical event, something that belongs more to legend than to the real history of our world. And yet, it carries lessons that remain deeply relevant today. The Earth has not changed its nature, it is still restless beneath our feet, still capable of shaping our destiny in a single violent moment. What happened then can help us understand both the fragility and the resilience of humanity now. One of the clearest lessons lies in the idea of vulnerability. The Toba eruption was not something early humans could control, prevent, or even fully comprehend. It was a force of nature on a scale beyond imagination. And yet, despite all our advancements, we remain just as vulnerable to such events today. If a supervolcano erupted in our modern world, with cities, farmlands, and global networks dependent on delicate balances, the consequences could be staggering. Crops would fail under darkened skies, transportation would halt as ash-covered runways and roads, global trade would collapse, and billions of people would feel the effects within months. It reminds us that for all our technology, we still live at the mercy of the planet's deeper rhythms. But Toba also teaches us something else: resilience. Against odds that seem impossible, our ancestors endured. They lived through hunger, cold, and uncertainty, and though their numbers may have dwindled, they carried the spark of life forward. In a world far less prepared than ours, with no machines, no medicine, no stored food supplies, they survived. That resilience is part of our inheritance. It suggests that in the face of disaster, humanity can adapt, endure, and even find ways to grow stronger. Modern science adds another layer to the lesson. By studying ancient eruptions, by reading the clues in ash layers, ice cores, and genetic data, we learn not only about the past but about how the earth works. This knowledge is our greatest defense. Early humans could only wonder at the darkened skies. We, however, can measure the gases, track the tremors, and map the magma chambers. While we cannot stop a supervolcano from erupting, we can prepare, building food reserves, planning responses, protecting vital infrastructure. Toba reminds us that ignorance leaves us helpless, but knowledge can give us a measure of readiness. There is also a lesson in humility. Modern civilization often sees itself as separate from nature, even as dominant over it. Yet Toba shows us that nature's power dwarfs our own. A single eruption reshaped the climate of the whole planet. Compared to that, even our largest cities and most powerful armies are small. To recognize this is not to surrender, but to find balance, to respect the forces that sustain and sometimes threaten us, and to remember that we are part of a larger system. And there is something else: perspective. The eruption of Toba may have nearly erased humanity, but it did not succeed. Instead, it became one of the crucibles through which our species passed. Without that trial, without that narrowing of the genetic line, we might be different today. Perhaps it was in surviving such trials that we developed deeper cooperation, stronger bonds, and greater ingenuity. Perhaps, without the shadow of that ancient disaster, the story of humanity would not have unfolded in the same way. In this light, the lesson is not only about fear, but about growth. Catastrophe and creativity often walk hand in hand. As we think about the future, Toba also reminds us of the interconnectedness of the earth. An eruption in one place can send ripples across the globe. What happened in Sumatra affected people in Africa, thousands of kilometers away. In our modern age, where global systems are even more tightly woven, such interconnections are even more critical. We are reminded that what happens in one corner of the world can touch us all. In a sense, Toba foreshadowed the global perspective we need today, not only for volcanoes but for all the great challenges we face, from climate change to pandemics. And yet, perhaps the most profound lesson is the simplest one: gratitude. To know that our species once teetered on the edge of extinction is to see the present moment differently. Every language spoken, every city built, every story told exists because a small number of people survived a catastrophe beyond imagining. Their endurance is the reason we are here. To remember Toba is to remember them, nameless, faceless, but vital. They kept the fire alive when the world seemed determined to snuff it out. In the end, the Toba eruption is both a warning and an inspiration. It warns us of the immense power of the earth, of the vulnerabilities we carry, and of the need to prepare. But it also inspires, reminding us that humanity has survived before, even in the darkest times, and that we carry within us the same resilience today. To look back is not to despair, but to recognize that we are capable of enduring, adapting, and finding meaning even in catastrophe. And so, as we listen to the quiet story of Toba, told across the gulf of 74,000 years, we find ourselves not only in awe of nature's power but in awe of our own persistence. The mountain roared, the skies darkened, the world grew cold, and yet humanity remained. That is the lesson, simple and profound. In the shadow of disaster, the flame of survival can still burn. As the story of Toba draws to a close, we are left with a vision of humanity that feels at once fragile and unbreakable. The eruption itself was among the most powerful events in the Earth's history, a force capable of dimming the sun, chilling the planet, and nearly erasing our species from existence. And yet, against those odds, we endured. That endurance is the thread that binds the past to the present, and it is what makes the Toba eruption not only a tale of destruction but also a testament to survival. When we imagine those years of ash and hunger, of dimmed skies and uncertain tomorrows, we can almost hear the silence of the world then, quieter forests, colder winds, and the muffled sound of footsteps through ash. Small bands of people huddled together, carrying fires through endless nights, teaching their children to find food in barren landscapes, whispering stories to explain a world transformed. Their lives were hard, their survival never guaranteed, yet each day they rose again, driven by something as simple and as profound as the will to live. It is easy for us, living in a world of abundance and light, to forget how precarious our beginnings were. But the Toba eruption reminds us that our history is not one of certainty. It is a story of near misses, of challenges faced and barely overcome. The genetic bottleneck left by Toba is written in all of us, in every cell of our bodies. It tells us that there was a time when humanity's entire future rested in the hands of a few thousand individuals, and that those few were enough. The conclusion we draw is not only about the fragility of human life, but also about its resilience. Even when the earth itself seemed to conspire against us, we adapted. We shared, we cooperated, we innovated. These qualities were not luxuries, they were necessities. They became part of what it meant to be human. In a sense, the eruption of Toba did not just test us, it shaped us, pushing us to become the creatures who could survive not only in the lush valleys of Africa, but across deserts, tundras, and mountains, and eventually into every corner of the world. As we close the story, we can imagine that final moment when the skies cleared, when the sun shone again with full strength after years of dimness. To the survivors, it must have felt like the rebirth of the world. Trees sprouted, animals returned, rivers ran clear once more. For children born in the darkness, it may have been the first time they truly saw the brilliance of daylight. That moment, the return of light after so much shadow, must have been filled with relief, gratitude, and awe. It was proof that even the deepest winters end, that even after catastrophe, life continues. The Toba eruption is a reminder of the narrowness of our escape. It shows us how close humanity came to being nothing more than a forgotten branch of the evolutionary tree. And yet, we did not vanish. We carried the memory forward, perhaps in myths, perhaps in whispers, but most certainly in our very survival. Every step of history that followed, the rise of language, the spread of agriculture, the birth of cities and civilizations, all of it was made possible because those early survivors endured through the darkest of times. To reflect on this is to feel a quiet sense of connection. We are bound not only to our immediate ancestors, but to those distant people who once stood at the edge of extinction. They are within us, their resilience etched into our DNA, their choices echoing across the millennia. We are their legacy, living proof that even the greatest disasters cannot easily extinguish the human spirit. And so, the conclusion of the story is not despair but wonder. The earth will always have its fury, and there will always be moments when we are reminded of our smallness. But the story of Toba tells us that smallness does not mean weakness. It tells us that survival is possible, even when the skies go dark. It tells us that humanity is stronger than it appears, bound together by cooperation, imagination, and hope. In the quiet of night, when we look up at the stars, we can think of those who once looked at a sky filled with ash and still found the courage to continue. We can honor them by remembering their endurance, by carrying forward the same spirit of resilience. For in the end, the story of Toba is not only about the mountain that erupted, but about the people who survived. We stand here today because of them. And that is the true conclusion, a narrow escape that became the foundation of everything we are. As the long story of the Toba supervolcano fades into the distance, what remains is not only the memory of destruction but also a sense of perspective. Human history is filled with triumphs, with the rise of civilizations, with discoveries and creations, but beneath all of those lies a foundation built on survival. Long before the first cities, before the first monuments, before the first written words, there was this narrow escape, a moment when humanity stood closer to extinction than at perhaps any other time. To think of it is to feel both humility and gratitude. Humility, because it reminds us that our place on earth is never guaranteed, that we are small creatures subject to forces far greater than ourselves. Gratitude, because those few who survived carried us through a doorway that might easily have closed forever. Their endurance, their resilience, their quiet determination to live one more day, allowed us to inherit a world that might otherwise have been empty of human voices. The lesson of Toba is not only about the magnitude of the eruption but also about the magnitude of survival. To endure in the face of an endless winter, to find food where there was little, to nurture children in a world of uncertainty, these acts, small and ordinary at the time, are extraordinary when seen through the lens of history. Each choice to persist, each spark of fire preserved through cold nights, was part of a chain that led directly to us. And so, when we think about Toba, we are not merely looking backward. We are also looking inward, to the qualities that remain within us. We carry the same capacity for fear, for suffering, but also for resilience, cooperation, and hope. These are not abstract traits. They were tested in the cold shadow of a supervolcano, and they endured. That endurance is still part of us. It is why, even today, we can adapt to challenges, why we can recover after disasters, and why we continue to move forward despite uncertainty. There is something profoundly comforting in knowing that humanity has already walked through its darkest night and emerged on the other side. The scale of Toba's eruption was immense, and yet the human story did not end there. Instead, it bent, shifted, and continued. It is a reminder that catastrophe, no matter how overwhelming, does not always mean the end. Sometimes it is the crucible that reshapes us, leaving us stronger, wiser, and more connected. The memory of Toba also connects us to the earth itself in a deeper way. We are not apart from this planet, not passengers on its surface, but part of its living fabric. Its restlessness is our story, its fury our challenge, its beauty our inheritance. To respect that relationship is perhaps one of the final lessons of Toba, to remember that survival does not mean conquering the earth, but living in awareness of its rhythms and power. As the tale of Toba settles into quiet reflection, we can imagine the voices of our distant ancestors carried across the millennia. They had no way of knowing that their survival would give rise to billions of people spread across the globe, to cities, to science, to art, to the endless complexity of human life. They knew only that they must live through the night, that they must protect the fire, that they must care for their children. And yet, from those simple choices, the entire future unfolded. That is perhaps the deepest reflection of all, the recognition that great histories are built from small moments. A family sharing food in the cold. A mother teaching her child to keep warm. A group of hunters finding shelter against the wind. None of them could have imagined that their survival would echo tens of thousands of years later in the lives of strangers across the world. But it did. And we are those strangers, the inheritors of their endurance. To close the story of Toba is not to close it entirely, because its lessons remain alive in us. They are in our resilience, in our cooperation, in the way we face uncertainty with hope. They are in our respect for the earth, in our awareness of how fragile and precious life truly is. And they are in the gratitude we feel for those who came before us, whose endurance gave us the chance to dream, to build, to live. So let this story end not with the roar of the mountain, but with the quiet recognition of survival. Against all odds, humanity endured. And in that endurance lies the true heart of our history. To understand the evolutionary split that made us different, we first need to imagine the stage upon which this story unfolded. For human history is not just the tale of one species alone. For most of prehistory, Earth was a world of many humans, each adapted to their own corners of the globe, each carrying forward their own solutions to the problem of survival. Let us travel back around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. The climate of Earth is restless, shifting between warmer interglacial periods and the long, grinding winters of ice ages. Enormous glaciers stretch across North America and Europe, locking up water and lowering sea levels. What are today's lush forests and green fields often lie buried under snow and ice. Elsewhere, the world blooms with diversity, sweeping African savannas filled with antelope and elephants, dense Asian jungles alive with the calls of birds and primates, island chains isolated by rising seas, and vast Siberian steppes where winds whistle endlessly across frozen ground. In this dramatic landscape, several kinds of humans walk the earth. They are not mere animals, they make fire, shape tools, and care for their young. And yet, they are not identical to us. Each species carries its own form, its own strengths, its own challenges. The most familiar to us are the Neanderthals. Stocky, strong, and remarkably well adapted to cold, they range across Europe and Western Asia. Their bodies are built for strength, with wide rib cages, muscular arms, and powerful hands that can craft tools and weapons from stone and wood. Their lives are difficult, but they are not brutish. Evidence shows they cared for the injured and buried their dead. Farther east, In the shadowy mountain ranges of Central Asia live the Denisovans, a mysterious group known to us mostly from fragments of bone and teeth discovered in a Siberian cave. They are close relatives of Neanderthals, yet distinct, carrying genetic adaptations for high-altitude living, perhaps surviving in regions where oxygen was scarce. They are ghosts in our story, known less by artifacts and more by the traces of their DNA that still flow quietly in many of us today. In Southeast Asia, on the islands of Flores, another kind of human exists, Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the Hobbit for its small stature, standing barely over a meter tall. Isolated for millennia, they have evolved along a different path, living a miniature but determined existence on their island home. Even deeper in time, there are echoes of Homo erectus, the great traveler of the ancient world, who once spread from Africa to Asia nearly 2 million years ago. Some of their descendants may still have been present in Southeast Asia during the rise of modern humans, quietly holding on in pockets of the world. And within Africa, there are still more branches of our family tree, species like Homo naledi, with a mixture of ancient and modern features, who lived far later than anyone expected, leaving behind caves filled with carefully placed bones. Africa, the cradle of humanity, was not a land of one species, but a mosaic of many. This is the world our ancestors were born into, a crowded stage, where different humans occupied different regions, sometimes overlapping, sometimes separated by vast distances. It was not a lonely earth, but a shared one. To imagine this world is to imagine variety. Different faces, different builds, different voices, all carrying the essence of humanity in unique forms. A Neanderthal child playing in the snow. A Denisovan hunter scaling rocky cliffs. A Flores islander moving silently through jungle undergrowth. All of them human, all of them surviving in their own ways. And yet, despite their strength, their intelligence, and their adaptations, none of these species would endure to the present day. Instead, it was our species, Homo sapiens, who emerged from Africa, carrying with us traits that would prove decisive. But before we ask why us, it is worth pausing on the richness of this shared stage. For in these ancient times, the boundaries between species were not as sharp as we might imagine. There was contact, sometimes interbreeding, sometimes competition, perhaps even cooperation. In caves, different kinds of humans may have seen each other's fires glowing faintly in the distance. On hunting grounds, they may have trailed the same herds, aware of one another as rivals, or perhaps as occasional allies. This interconnectedness is part of what makes the story so fascinating. The evolutionary split that made us different did not happen in isolation. It happened against a backdrop of diversity, with other humans nearby, mirroring us in form yet diverging in destiny. Scientists today try to reconstruct this stage through fragments, bones buried in sediment, tools left behind in caves, DNA strands preserved in teeth. Piece by piece, they rebuild the puzzle, revealing not a straight line of progress but a branching tree, with twigs, offshoots, and broken branches. Each branch once alive, vibrant, filled with living beings who laughed, struggled, and hoped as we do. It is humbling to recognize that we are not the inevitable outcome of evolution, but just one of many experiments. Our story could have been otherwise. If you stood 100,000 years ago on the plains of Europe, you might have met a Neanderthal instead of a sapiens. If you traveled to Siberia, it might have been Denisovans who greeted you. If you wandered onto Flores, you might have seen tiny humans unlike any you had imagined. The modern world, with only one kind of human, is an anomaly, a quiet after the storm of diversity. And so, as we continue this journey, let us carry with us this picture, a planet filled with many humans, each adapted to their world, each solving the riddle of survival in their own way. The stage was set not for one species, but for many. And yet, in time, only one would remain. This stage of evolution, this crowded, vibrant, precarious world, is the backdrop for the great mystery. For the question we ask is not merely what made us different, but why we endured when others did not. In the next chapter, we will step closer to these ancient cousins, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and more, and see who they were, what strengths they carried, and how they shaped the shared story of humanity. Only by knowing them can we begin to understand the differences that would eventually set us apart. To step further into this story, we must meet those who once walked beside us, our ancient cousins. They were not myths, not half-formed creatures, but true humans in their own right. Each had families, hopes of survival, and ways of understanding the world. Their stories, though often reduced to bones and fragments in museums, are far richer and more human than we sometimes imagine. Let us begin with the most familiar, the Neanderthals. For more than 300,000 years, Neanderthals roamed the lands of Europe and Western Asia. They lived through ice and cold, through long winters when survival meant strength and endurance. Their bodies told the story of adaptation, shorter limbs and stocky frames to conserve heat, powerful muscles for hunting large animals, broad noses to warm cold air before it reached their lungs. In every way, they were sculpted by the demands of their environment. But they were not only creatures of survival. Archaeological evidence reveals they made tools with care and precision, shaping stone into sharp blades and hafting them onto wooden shafts to create effective spears. They controlled fire, built shelters, and crafted clothing from animal hides. These were not simple skills, they were acts of ingenuity, requiring planning and cooperation. For a long time, the popular image of Neanderthals was unfair, that of brutish, slow-witted beings doomed to fail. But the more we learn, the more this picture fades. We now know Neanderthals likely cared for the sick and injured, keeping them alive far beyond what chance alone would allow. They buried their dead, sometimes with grave goods, a sign, perhaps, of symbolic thought, of a sense of meaning beyond the physical. In caves, traces of pigments and ornaments suggest they may have painted their bodies or decorated themselves with shells. These small acts whisper of imagination, of identity, of something very close to what we call culture. Still, despite their strengths, Neanderthals did not endure. Around 40,000 years ago, their presence fades from the archaeological record. The reasons remain debated: competition with our species, climate changes that strained their resources, or the slow blending of their communities into ours through interbreeding. Perhaps it was not one cause but many, converging like threads in a tapestry. Now, let us turn east to the Denisovans, a people more shadow than substance. Unlike the Neanderthals, whose remains are found across Europe and the Middle East, Denisovans are known from only a handful of discoveries. A finger bone and a few teeth, found deep within a cave in Siberia, were enough to reveal their existence. And yet, from this tiny evidence, DNA has spoken volumes. Denisovans, like Neanderthals, were close relatives of ours, branching from the same ancestral line. But what made them remarkable was their adaptability. Their genetic legacy survives in modern humans, especially in populations of Tibet and Melanesia. From this inheritance, scientists discovered that Denisovans carried traits that helped them thrive at high altitudes, where oxygen is scarce. Imagine them climbing the rugged mountain slopes of Central Asia, lungs and blood finely tuned to thin air that would leave us gasping. Their tools and ways of life remain largely mysterious, veiled by the scarcity of physical remains. And yet their DNA lives on, woven into our own. In that sense, they are not entirely gone. They whisper to us still, not through words or artifacts, but through the quiet code written in our cells. Farther south, across the islands of Southeast Asia, another cousin lived a very different story, Homo floresiensis, sometimes called the Hobbit. Discovered in a cave on the island of Flores in Indonesia, these humans stood little more than a meter tall. Their skulls were small, their brains much smaller than ours, yet they made tools, hunted, and survived in isolation for thousands of years. Scientists believe their tiny size was an adaptation to their island environment, where resources were limited and smaller bodies required less food. The existence of Homo floresiensis reminds us that evolution is not a straight ladder of progress but a tree, branching and adapting in many directions. On Flores, small humans thrived while elsewhere, larger and more robust species dominated. In each case, survival was not about being more advanced, but about fitting the environment. And still, there are more. In the caves of South Africa, deep underground, scientists found the remains of Homo naledi, a species with a curious mixture of traits. Their hands and feet were surprisingly modern, but their brains were small, more like earlier humans. Yet the way their remains were found suggested deliberate placement, as though they had been laid to rest intentionally. If true, this would mean that even with smaller brains, Homo naledi engaged in rituals we once thought uniquely ours. Each of these cousins, Neanderthal, Denisovan, Flores human, naledi, carried a fragment of the human story. They were not primitive mistakes, but successful survivors in their own times and places. Each species endured for thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years, before vanishing. When we think of them now, it is easy to focus only on their extinction. But consider instead how long they thrived. Neanderthals lived far longer than any single civilization in human history. Homo erectus persisted for nearly 2 million years, a span dwarfing the entire story of modern nations. Even Homo floresiensis endured until just 50,000 years ago, a time when our own ancestors were already painting caves and migrating across continents. And in a quiet way, they are not gone. Their DNA lives on in us, their tools lie waiting in caves, their bones tell stories of resilience. Their existence shaped ours, through encounters, through interbreeding, through the lessons of survival written into our shared past. To meet our ancient cousins is to be reminded that we are not alone in the human story. We are the last survivors of a once crowded family, carrying forward not only our own legacy but theirs as well. And yet, as we look at them, we must ask the question again, what was it that set us apart? For they were strong, intelligent, adaptable, and still, in the end, it was our kind that remained. The answer lies in the subtler realms, not in muscles or bones, but in the mind. For it was in the brain, in thought and imagination, that the split between us and our cousins may have truly taken place. In the next section, we will explore this spark of difference, the anatomy of our brains, the organization of thought, and the beginnings of something that would transform survival into story and life into culture. When we place the bones of Homo sapiens beside those of our ancient cousins, the differences can seem small. A Neanderthal skull, for instance, is strikingly similar to ours in size and shape, yet a careful eye reveals subtle contrasts: the slope of the forehead, the angle of the brow ridge, the curve of the back of the skull. These differences may appear minor, yet within them may lie the clues to the evolutionary split that shaped our destiny. At the center of it all is the human brain. Both Neanderthals and modern humans had large brains, comparable in volume. In fact, Neanderthal brains were on average slightly larger than ours. But sheer size alone does not tell the full story. What mattered was not only the volume, but how that brain was organized and what networks of thought it made possible. Our brains are uniquely shaped. Where Neanderthals had elongated skulls, ours are more rounded, a subtle shift that made room for a reorganization of the inner landscape. This globular shape allowed for expansion in regions linked to complex thought, the prefrontal cortex, the parietal lobes, and the areas that integrate memory, planning, and imagination. It was not so much how much brain we had, but how it was wired. The prefrontal cortex, in particular, became a kind of command center. It is here that abstract reasoning takes shape, where long-term planning is born, where the ability to hold multiple ideas at once allows us to imagine futures and remember pasts. For our ancestors, this shift may have meant the difference between reacting to the environment and envisioning strategies far beyond the present moment. Language, too, found fertile ground in this architecture. The arrangement of regions like Broca's area and Wernicke's area supported the development of complex speech, enabling humans not just to signal danger or need, but to weave ideas together into stories, instructions, and myths. This capacity, more than any tool or muscle, gave our ancestors an advantage, for words can travel faster than spears, and stories can unite people across generations. Another subtle difference lay in the way our brains connected emotion with cognition. The wiring between limbic regions and higher cortical areas gave us a deep capacity for empathy, for understanding not only our own feelings but those of others. This ability to imagine what another person might be thinking or experiencing, often called theory of mind, may have transformed survival. Groups that could cooperate, anticipate, and comfort one another stood stronger against the challenges of ice, famine, and predators. We also see signs of enhanced memory and symbolic thought. The ability to remember not just immediate experiences, but long chains of cause and effect allowed humans to build cumulative culture, knowledge passed down, improved upon, and shared widely. While Neanderthals made effective tools, the archaeological record suggests they remained relatively stable over time. Homo sapiens, in contrast, continually refined techniques, developing new tool types, experimenting with materials, and spreading innovations across vast distances. These differences were not sudden miracles, but gradual shifts, layered over thousands of years. Tiny changes in brain structure, in neural connectivity, in gene expression all accumulated into a spark of difference. That spark did not make us superior in every way. Neanderthals were stronger, Denisovans adapted better to altitude, and other species had their own special strengths. But the spark gave us flexibility, imagination, and the ability to create shared meaning. Consider what this meant around the campfire. A Neanderthal might have taught a child how to knap a stone tool or explained the dangers of a hunt. But a Homo sapiens ancestor could tell a story that encoded knowledge. Wrapped in narrative, remembered and retold across seasons. Through story, lessons were not just practical but enduring, embedding themselves in culture and identity. In this way, information could survive beyond a single lifetime. It could leap across generations, binding communities with shared myths and guiding behavior long after the original speaker was gone. Storytelling, born from the architecture of our brains, became a bridge between past, present, and future. Even art, ritual, and imagination may have sprung from this spark. The rounded skull that cradled a reorganized brain gave rise not only to survival skills but to the urge to paint, to sing, to dance, to create symbols that stood for things unseen. It is in these acts, cave paintings, carved figures, beads strung as ornaments, that we glimpse the flowering of a mind different in kind, not just in degree. Scientists search for genetic clues to this transformation. One gene in particular, FOXP2, is linked to speech and language, and while Neanderthals carried a similar version, subtle differences may have shaped how it functioned in us. Other genes affecting brain growth and synaptic plasticity may have played roles, each small in itself, yet together forming a cascade that altered the way thought flowed. Of course, we cannot peer directly into the minds of Neanderthals or Denisovans. We reconstruct them from fragments of bone, from artifacts left in caves, from the echoes preserved in our DNA. But the evidence suggests that in our ancestors, something shifted, not a sudden leap, but a gentle unfolding of capacities that allowed us to imagine more, plan farther, and connect deeper. This, perhaps, was the spark of difference. Not a flame that burned brighter in every way, but one that flickered with unique light. A spark that allowed us to carry culture forward, to weave words and art into the fabric of survival, and to dream of futures not yet born. And yet, as with all mysteries, humility is required. We do not know exactly what made the decisive difference. Was it brain wiring? Was it language? Was it social empathy? Perhaps it was all of these, intertwined, feeding one another in feedback loops that grew stronger over generations. What we do know is that this spark set the stage for what came next, the flowering of language and storytelling. For once the mind could shape words into symbols and symbols into meaning, humanity stepped into a new realm. In the next section, we will trace this journey, how language emerged, how stories bound groups together, and how the gift of communication may have been the very tool that ensured our survival when other humans faded into the shadows of time. Imagine, for a moment, a quiet evening in the deep past. The hunt is over, fires glow against the darkness, and families gather together. Some are eating, some are resting, but in the circle of warmth, words begin to flow. A parent tells a child how to shape a spear, how to watch for the tracks of animals, how to remember the path through the forest. But slowly, the words go further. They begin to describe not only what is here and now, but what happened yesterday, or what might come tomorrow. They speak of dangers unseen, of spirits in the forest, of ancestors whose names still linger. What begins as communication becomes something larger, it becomes storytelling. Language was perhaps the most profound gift of the evolutionary split. Other animals communicate, birds sing, wolves howl, dolphins click and whistle. Even our ancient cousins, like Neanderthals, likely had forms of speech. But in our species, language became something more layered, more symbolic, more powerful. It allowed us not only to share information, but to share imagination. The structure of our brains, shaped by the spark of difference, supported this leap. The regions responsible for speech and comprehension grew interconnected, creating a system able to produce complex sentences, to place ideas in sequence, to link concepts with symbols. A sound could mean not just food or danger, but entire stories of where food was found, when danger might return, and who among the group must be warned. Think of how revolutionary this was. A single person could experience something, a river flooding, a predator prowling, a plant proving poisonous, and instead of that knowledge dying with them, it could be passed to others, retold, remembered, and improved upon. Language turned individual experience into collective memory. But language was more than survival. It became a bond. Around the fire, stories wove communities together, creating shared myths and identities. Groups could imagine themselves not just as families, but as tribes, clans, and people with histories stretching back into the past. These shared stories fostered trust, cooperation, and unity, all of which gave Homo sapiens an edge in survival. Consider the difference this made compared to our cousins. Neanderthals, as evidence suggests, communicated effectively, but their toolkits and cultural expressions remained relatively stable across thousands of years. Homo sapiens, fueled by language, advanced rapidly. Tools diversified, strategies multiplied, ideas spread from one group to another. Innovation no longer depended solely on individual genius but could ripple through communities, carried on the current of words. Through language, teaching became richer. A skill could be broken down into steps, described carefully, practiced and refined. Knowledge no longer depended on observation alone but could be instructed, explained, corrected. A child could learn not only by watching but by listening, by hearing tales of hunts they had never seen, dangers they had never faced. And then came the leap into symbolism, words standing not just for things but for ideas. Through this shift, humans began to tell not only what is, but what might be. They imagined spirits, ancestors, gods, and futures. They told myths of creation, of how the world began, of why the sun rises and sets. These stories, though unverifiable, shaped behavior, offered comfort, and gave meaning to life's mysteries. In caves across Europe, paintings appear around 40,000 years ago, filled with animals, handprints, and abstract shapes. Some may have been teaching tools, others rituals, others pure imagination. What links them all is the presence of symbolic thought, carried and reinforced by language. A painting of a bison on a cave wall may have been accompanied by words, by chants, by stories passed from mouth to ear. Together, they transformed survival into culture. Storytelling also allowed humans to plan in ways other species could not. A hunt could be organized before it began, strategies discussed, roles assigned. People could imagine the movements of animals, the dangers of terrain, the needs of the group, all without stepping into the field. This ability to model reality in words gave humans a decisive advantage. But perhaps the greatest power of language was emotional. Through words, we could comfort, persuade, inspire. We could share not only facts but feelings. We could tell someone not just what we saw, but what we felt, the fear of darkness, the joy of reunion, the sorrow of loss. In doing so, we created empathy, drawing people together in bonds that strengthened the group. It is no wonder, then, that language and storytelling may have been the quiet force that ensured our survival while others faded. For while strength and adaptation could meet immediate challenges, it was stories that carried us beyond the moment. Stories helped us remember who we were, where we came from, and where we were going. They guided us through famine, disaster, and migration, holding communities together even when landscapes shifted and climates grew harsh. Of course, we cannot know the first words ever spoken, nor the first story ever told. These moments are lost to time, carried only as echoes in our minds. But we see their legacy in every culture on earth today. Every people has myths of origin, tales of ancestors, songs of triumph and loss. These are not modern inventions, but ancient inheritances, rooted in the deep past of Homo sapiens. Language gave us survival. Storytelling gave us identity. Together, they formed the core of what made us different, not only clever animals, but meaning makers. And so, as we move forward, we see how this flowering of imagination did not stop at words alone. It spilled into art, into tools, into music and symbols carved in bone. It colored the world with creativity, marking the true dawn of what we now call culture. In the next section, we will step into this realm of imagination. We will look at the tools, the art, the songs, and the symbols that turned daily survival into something more. For when humans began to create not only for need but for beauty and meaning, we crossed yet another threshold, one that would shape the destiny of our species. Close your eyes and picture a small band of humans moving across an ancient landscape. Their lives are shaped by survival, finding food, keeping warm, avoiding danger. But in their hands, something remarkable glints in the fading light. A stone chipped into a blade. A bone carved into a needle. A piece of ochre ground into powder, ready to mark skin or stone. These are not just objects of utility, they are signs of imagination stirring in the human mind. Tools came first, long before art. For millions of years, early humans shaped stone to cut meat, scrape hides, and crack bones for marrow. Homo habilis, known as the handyman, began this journey nearly 2.5 million years ago. But by the time of Homo sapiens, tools had reached new levels of refinement. Our ancestors created blades from flint, sharper than any claw or tooth. They fashioned composite tools, spears with stone tips bound by sinew and resin. They carved fishhooks from bone, pierced shells to make beads, and even constructed bows and arrows, extending the reach of their hunts. Each of these creations carried not just skill but foresight. A spear is not made in an instant of need. It requires preparation, planning, and an understanding of cause and effect. Neanderthals, too, made tools, finely crafted scrapers, hand axes, and spears. But the toolkit of Homo sapiens grew more diverse, more experimental. Innovation spread quickly from group to group, suggesting that language and social networks allowed ideas to travel farther and faster. A discovery made in one valley could be shared across mountains and rivers, multiplying human ingenuity. But alongside practicality, something emerged, a desire to create for beauty, for meaning, for expression. This was the dawn of art. In caves across Europe, Africa, and Asia, humans left behind breathtaking images. Herds of bison charging across stone walls, horses galloping in ochre and charcoal, mammoths painted with delicate strokes. These were not random doodles. They were deliberate, careful, often hidden deep within caves where firelight flickered across the images, bringing them to life. Some paintings are more than 40,000 years old, as ancient as our earliest migrations into Europe. Why did they paint? Some believe these images were hunting magic, rituals meant to ensure success. Others think they were records, ways of preserving knowledge. Still others suggest they were acts of imagination for their own sake, an urge to create beauty in a harsh world. Whatever their purpose, they reveal minds capable of abstraction, of seeing not just what is but what could be represented. Beyond caves, humans carved figures, small statues known as Venus figurines, often emphasizing fertility and life. They strung beads from shells and teeth, wore ornaments of bone and ivory, and etched patterns onto tools. These acts served no survival function in the strictest sense, yet they endured. They spoke of identity, of belonging, of shared meaning. To wear a necklace of shells was to say something beyond hunger and cold. It was to mark oneself as part of a group, as someone with a story. Music, too, joined the human world. Flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory have been found, dating back more than 35,000 years. Imagine the haunting sound of those first melodies, drifting through a cave, mingling with firelight and shadows. Music may have strengthened bonds, soothed children, accompanied rituals. It was another way humans turned experience into expression. What makes these creations so powerful is that they reveal a shift in the human mind. Tools for survival were necessary. But art, jewelry, music, these were acts of imagination. They were evidence that Homo sapiens lived not only in the physical world but also in a symbolic one. They carried ideas of identity, beauty, and transcendence. They could imagine what was not present, give shape to the unseen, and make it real through creation. This imaginative leap gave Homo sapiens a decisive advantage. Art and symbols strengthened social bonds. They created shared identities, allowing larger groups to cooperate without constant personal contact. A symbol painted on a cave wall or worn around the neck could say, "We are one people." This kind of cohesion may have allowed larger, more flexible social groups, capable of surviving challenges that fractured smaller bands. Contrast this with Neanderthals. Evidence shows they, too, used pigments and ornaments, perhaps even engaged in symbolic behavior. But the scale and frequency were different. For Homo sapiens, art became central, widespread, and deeply woven into daily life. The sheer abundance of symbolic artifacts suggests that imagination was not just a trait but a defining feature. Another layer of difference lies in experimentation. Human groups adapted their toolkits to different environments, fishhooks for coasts, bows for forests, needles for cold climates. They combined function with creativity, shaping technology to fit diverse needs. Innovation was constant, carried forward by language, memory, and story. The dawn of imagination also reshaped survival itself. Rituals may have offered comfort in times of loss, reinforcing resilience. Shared songs and dances may have bound groups during migrations, sustaining morale. Art may have inspired courage in the face of uncertainty. These creations were not luxuries, they were lifelines of meaning, helping humans endure hardship with a sense of purpose. When we think of this dawn, it is worth pausing on its emotional dimension. Imagine a child in an Ice Age shelter, holding a carved figurine. Imagine the first notes of a flute echoing in the darkness. Imagine the pride of wearing a necklace made from shells gathered on a distant shore. These are not just artifacts. They are glimpses into the human heart, beating across tens of thousands of years. Tools kept us alive. Art made us human. Together, they represent the flowering of imagination that turned survival into culture and existence into expression. And yet, daily life was not always marked by creation. Most of the time, it was a struggle, hunting, gathering, moving, enduring. To truly understand our ancestors, we must step into their world, not only in art and tools but in the rhythms of everyday living. In the next section, we will slow down and walk beside them. We will see how they hunted, what they ate, how they raised children, and how they faced the changing seasons. For in daily life lies the foundation of every great story, the steady heartbeat of survival upon which imagination was built. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine stepping into the world of early humans. There are no cities, no villages, no roads stretching into the distance. The land is wild and unbroken, shaped only by rivers, mountains, forests, and plains. A small group of people moves carefully across this landscape, carrying with them everything they need to survive. Their lives are not measured in hours and minutes, but in the rising and setting of the sun, in the seasons of plants and the migrations of animals. This was daily life for our ancestors, a rhythm of survival and community that stretched across thousands of years. Each morning began with the question of food. Foraging was essential, and much of human life depended on knowing the land intimately. Women, children, and sometimes men gathered roots, berries, nuts, and fruits, always attentive to what could nourish and what could poison. This knowledge was precious, passed down through generations by word and example. A berry that looked inviting might bring sickness, while a bitter root might hold hidden nourishment if prepared correctly. The landscape was not just background, it was a living teacher demanding memory and attention. Hunting was more dangerous but equally vital. Men, though not always exclusively, often organized into small parties to track game. Sometimes it was a small animal caught with traps or spears. Other times it was a larger creature, a deer, a bison, or even a mammoth. Such hunts required patience, cooperation, and courage. Hunters might stalk prey for hours, moving silently through brush and grass, watching the wind so their scent did not betray them. When the moment came, they had to strike with speed and precision, knowing that failure could mean injury or starvation. The tools of hunting were simple yet ingenious. Spears tipped with stone, sometimes propelled with atlatls to increase range. Later, bows and arrows gave hunters even greater reach. Small groups coordinated their movements, sometimes driving animals toward traps or cliffs, using the landscape itself as a weapon. Success was never guaranteed, but when a large animal fell, it meant days of food, hides for clothing, bones for tools, and sinew for binding. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted, because waste could mean weakness, and weakness meant death. Clothing, too, was shaped by necessity. In colder regions, humans sewed together hides with bone needles, layering furs to keep out the chill. In warmer places, lighter coverings sufficed, made from softened skins or woven fibers. Ornamentation appeared early, beads strung on cords, painted patterns, carved pendants. Clothing was not only protection from the elements, but also a canvas of identity, a way to belong to the group or to show status within it. Shelter varied depending on the land. Sometimes, caves provided ready-made protection. At other times, humans built with what they had: wood, bone, stone, and hides stretched across frames. These shelters were temporary, for groups were often on the move, following herds or seeking new lands when resources grew scarce. Life was mobile, and so were the homes people carried with them. The fire at the center of camp was constant, tended carefully, its sparks and warmth more valuable than any possession. Fire was warmth in the cold, light in the darkness, and safety against predators. Around it, families cooked food, shared stories, and soothed their fears. Daily work was shared. Men hunted, but they also gathered when needed. Women foraged, but they also crafted tools, tended children, and joined in hunts when the opportunity arose. Children were not passive. From a young age they learned by watching, by imitating, by carrying small tasks. They gathered sticks for fire, learned which plants were safe, practiced with small tools. Childhood was shorter than ours, yet it was filled with learning that ensured the survival of the group. Elders, though often few in number, were deeply respected. Their knowledge of land, weather, and tradition made them invaluable. Their words carried with the weight of memory. Life was never without danger. Illness could sweep through a group quickly, with no medicine beyond herbs and rest. Injuries from hunts or accidents could prove fatal, even if the wound was small. Predators roamed the same lands: lions, wolves, and hyenas in Africa, bears and cave lions in Europe, saber-toothed cats in the Americas. Early humans were not always the hunters. Sometimes they were the hunted. Yet through cooperation, fire, and weapons, they managed to keep danger at bay, carving out a place for themselves in a world that was both hostile and beautiful. Seasons brought constant change. In summer, food might be plentiful, fruits ripening, animals fattened. In winter, scarcity pressed close, demanding preparation. Groups stored what they could: dried meat, preserved nuts and seeds. Migrations followed the rhythms of nature, and humans were always alert to signs: the return of birds, the growth of plants, the tracks of animals in mud or snow. Life was a constant negotiation with the land, a dance of adaptation and resilience. But amid all this hardship, there was also tenderness and joy. Parents cared deeply for children, protecting and teaching them. Groups sang together, danced, and laughed around the fire. Storytelling turned the ordinary into memory, linking one day to the next, one generation to another. Rituals gave shape to grief, honoring those who died and perhaps imagining their presence still. Moments of beauty: a song, a carved ornament, a shared meal lifted the spirit and gave strength against the struggles of survival. Daily life was not easy, but it was rich in its own way. It demanded awareness, cooperation, and resilience. Every person mattered. Every skill, from tracking to cooking to healing, had its place. The bonds between people were strong because they had to be. Alone, survival was nearly impossible. Together, it became manageable, even meaningful. As we imagine their lives, we begin to see the foundations of our own. The rhythm of work and rest, the comfort of community, the joy of sharing food, the need for meaning in hardship, these are not distant relics but threads still woven into our lives today. Our ancestors lived with less, yet they lived with depth, shaped by the earth and by one another. And so, in their footsteps, we glimpse ourselves. The same need for belonging, the same reliance on family, the same spark of imagination carried them through days of hunger and nights of cold. Their world was different, but their humanity was already the same. The ancient world was never quite for long. Though early humans lived in small bands scattered across vast landscapes, their paths often crossed with other beings who were strikingly similar, yet different enough to create tension. For tens of thousands of years, Homo sapiens were not the only humans walking the earth. Neanderthals roamed Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans lived somewhere farther east, their traces found in the shadows of Siberian caves. Other species still lingered: Homo floresiensis on a small island in Indonesia, Homo erectus in Asia. It was a crowded stage, and survival. meant not only facing the wild but also encountering cousins who competed for the same resources. When groups of Homo sapiens entered Europe around 45,000 years ago, they stepped into Neanderthal territory. The Neanderthals had been there for hundreds of thousands of years, enduring Ice Age winters, hunting large game, and living in small groups. They were strong, resourceful, and well adapted to the cold. But something happened when Homo sapiens arrived. Within a few thousand years, the Neanderthals were gone. The reasons are layered and complex. Some scholars suggest competition played the greatest role. Both species hunted similar animals and used similar shelter and resources. When two capable hunters target the same prey, one will eventually falter. Homo sapiens, with their broader toolkits, wider social networks, and perhaps greater adaptability, may have gradually pushed Neanderthals to the margins. Others point to climate shifts. The Ice Age was not steady but full of sharp changes, sudden freezes, and warmer interludes. These fluctuations strained ecosystems. Large animals became scarcer, and smaller, faster prey demanded new hunting techniques. Homo sapiens, with bows, nets, and traps, adjusted quickly. Neanderthals, reliant on close-range hunting, may have struggled. There is also the story of contact of interbreeding. Genetic studies today reveal that most people outside Africa carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, a trace of encounters long ago. Some encounters may have been peaceful, even intimate. Yet these exchanges were not enough to preserve Neanderthals as a distinct group. Their numbers dwindled, and eventually they disappeared, leaving only fragments in our blood. The Denisovans, more mysterious still, left few bones but a strong genetic legacy. Their DNA lives on in people of Asia and the Pacific, proof that sapiens met them, mixed with them, and then watched them fade. Perhaps they, too, were outcompeted, their lands overtaken, their populations thinned by the same challenges that erased Neanderthals. Other species vanished with less trace. On Flores Island, tiny humans known as hobbits lived for thousands of years, only 3 feet tall, crafting tools and hunting small animals. When larger humans arrived, their world changed forever. Competition, diseases carried by newcomers, or simple bad luck in an already fragile ecosystem may have ended their story. These extinctions remind us that survival was never guaranteed. Being human did not mean being invincible. Many forms of humanity rose and fell, shaped by shifting climates, dangerous predators, and the relentless test of adaptation. What made Homo sapiens different was not that we were stronger or fiercer, but that we were flexible. We could shift our tools, our strategies, even our diets. We could adapt faster, and in a world of constant change, that adaptability proved decisive. But survival was not just about rivalry. Sometimes coexistence was possible. Archaeological sites show overlapping layers of Neanderthal and sapiens use, suggesting that for a time, they lived side by side. They may have traded, shared knowledge, or even borrowed from each other's toolkits. Yet, in the long sweep of time, coexistence gave way to dominance. The sapiens' populations grew, their spread unstoppable, while other humans diminished. Survival also demanded resilience against forces greater than any rival species. Volcanic eruptions darkened skies. A supervolcano in Indonesia around 74,000 years ago may have plunged the Earth into years of cooling. Groups shrank to tiny numbers, clinging to survival in isolated refuges. Epidemics, too, may have swept through camps, carried by close contact and lack of immunity. Natural disasters struck without warning: floods, fires, storms. In each case, only those who could endure, adapt, and remember lessons stood a chance. The survival of Homo sapiens was not inevitable. There were moments when the species could have vanished as easily as its cousins. Yet somehow, we endured. Cooperation was a large part of this. Sapiens formed larger groups, with social ties extending beyond immediate families. These networks provided support in hard times, sharing food, caring for the sick, raising children collectively. Such bonds created safety nets that other species may have lacked. Conflict, however, was never far away. When resources were scarce, rival groups of sapiens themselves may have fought. Violence left marks on bones, injuries that speak of clashes over territory or hunting grounds. Yet alongside conflict came negotiation, alliances, and the weaving of stories that bound groups together in peace. This balance between struggle and cooperation shaped the destiny of humanity. As we reflect on these vanished cousins, we feel both sorrow and awe. Sorrow for the worlds lost, the songs, the languages, the ways of life that disappeared into silence. Awe for the resilience of our ancestors, who walked among rivals and disasters yet found ways to endure. Every survival carried forward knowledge, memory, and imagination, building step by step toward the world we know today. In the stillness of night, when we imagine the long fires of the past, we remember that our story is built upon countless endings. The silence of Neanderthal caves, the emptiness of Denisovan valleys, the vanished footprints of floors, all of these rest beneath our own. And from them, we inherited not only fragments of DNA but also the heavy truth that survival was fragile, never promised, always earned. And so, the path narrowed. One by one, the other humans vanished, until only Homo sapiens remained. Yet the memory of their presence lingers, woven into our genes and into the deep history of our kind. From this crucible of extinction and survival, a single lineage carried forward. The stage was set for migrations that would stretch across the entire planet, for challenges yet greater, and for the unfolding of a human story both fragile and enduring. Even after centuries of study, the story of our origins is still filled with questions. Archaeologists, anthropologists, and geneticists have uncovered remarkable clues, but many pieces of the puzzle remain missing. Each discovery answers one question and then opens the door to another. As we reflect on the evolutionary split that set Homo sapiens apart, we realize just how much we still do not know. These mysteries continue to whisper across time, like echoes in a cave, reminding us that the past is never fully silent. One of the deepest mysteries concerns language. We know that Homo sapiens developed complex speech, and that this ability set us apart from other species. But when, exactly, did language first appear? Was it fully formed tens of thousands of years ago, or did it emerge slowly, piece by piece, over countless generations? No written records exist from that time, and bones do not preserve the sounds of speech. Scientists examine skulls, throat structures, and the shapes of ancient hyoid bones to guess at the capacity for language, but certainty remains out of reach. We can only imagine the first sentences spoken in the darkness, words shaping thoughts in ways that changed the destiny of humankind. Another enduring question is why we, out of so many human species, survived while the others faded. Was it a matter of sheer chance, or did something in our biology grant us an edge? Some point to adaptability, our ability to live in deserts, forests, tundra, and islands. Others point to social structures, to the way our ancestors supported one another. But it is also possible that survival was fragile, a matter of timing and luck. If the climate had shifted differently, or if disaster had struck at the wrong moment, perhaps the Neanderthals or Denisovans would be the ones telling this story today, and Homo sapiens would be a name remembered only in bones. We are also left wondering about our cousins' inner worlds. Neanderthals buried their dead, sometimes with tools or flowers. Did this reflect belief in an afterlife, or simply respect for the body? Denisovans, known mostly from fragments of bone and tooth, leave even fewer clues. What songs did they sing? What stories did they tell? What fears and hopes filled their nights? These are questions that science may never fully answer, for they dwell in the realm of experience and imagination. The timeline of our migrations is another source of mystery. We know that Homo sapiens began in Africa, but the precise routes and timing of our spread across the globe remain debated. Some evidence suggests early waves of migration that failed, groups who ventured out but did not survive long enough to leave lasting descendants. Others show surprising signs of contact, like tools in distant lands that appear older than expected. Did small bands reach new continents earlier than we thought? Did they meet other humans there, or arrive too late? Each new site uncovered shifts the map of our journey, and with it, the story of how we came to inhabit every corner of Earth. There are also mysteries locked within our very DNA. Modern studies reveal traces of interbreeding, Neanderthal genes shaping aspects of our immune system, Denisovan genes helping people adapt to high altitudes in the Himalayas. But how much of our identity comes from these ancient unions? Were they rare events, or common across thousands of years? Did they bring conflict, or moments of shared humanity? Our blood carries the evidence, yet the details of those encounters remain hidden in the silence of time. Art, too, holds secrets. We find paintings deep in caves, carvings on ivory, beads of shell and bone. But what did they mean? Were they offerings to spirits, records of hunts, or simple expressions of joy? Why do certain symbols repeat across continents and cultures, long before contact was possible? Spirals, dots, handprints, are they echoes of a shared origin, or coincidences born of the human mind's natural patterns? Each mark on stone is a voice across ages, but one we can only partly interpret. Even the pace of our own evolution raises questions. Some argue that the great leap forward in creativity and technology happened suddenly around 40,000 years ago. Others suggest it was gradual, stretched over hundreds of thousands of years, with many false starts. Was there a single spark that lit the flame of imagination, or was it a slow-burning fire that eventually roared to life? This remains one of the central debates in understanding what made us human. Finally, we wonder about the emotional lives of our ancestors. What did love mean to them, or grief, or hope? We see bones healed after injury, suggesting care. We see children buried with tenderness, suggesting mourning. But the depth of their feelings, the quiet joys and sorrows that filled their days, remain beyond our reach. And yet, when we look at them through the fragments they left behind, it is difficult not to feel a connection, as though their mysteries are also part of ourselves. These unanswered questions do not weaken the story of our origins. Instead, they make it more compelling. They remind us that history is alive, that new discoveries may one day change everything we believe to be true. A single cave painting, a single bone fragment, a single strand of DNA could reshape our understanding of who we are and how we came to be. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, that we, the only surviving humans, continue to search for the others. In their absence, we seek their stories, piecing together shadows to glimpse their lives. In doing so, we not only honor them but also better understand ourselves. For the mysteries of our past are not distant curiosities. They are mirrors, reflecting the questions we still ask today about identity, survival, and meaning. The evolutionary split that set us apart did not end the story. It began a journey that is still unfolding, still full of enigmas and secrets waiting beneath the earth. And as we drift deeper into reflection, we carry those mysteries with us unanswered, perhaps unanswerable, yet endlessly fascinating, like the soft echo of voices just beyond reach. When we speak of the evolutionary split that set Homo sapiens apart, we are not only speaking of a distant event buried in prehistory. We are also speaking of a legacy that still lives within us. The choices, abilities, and differences that defined our species tens of thousands of years ago continue to shape the way we think, feel, and live today. The past is not gone, it lingers in our bodies, in our cultures, and in the very way we see the world. The most obvious legacy lies in our capacity for imagination and creativity. From the earliest cave paintings to the modern skyscrapers that touch the sky, this thread has remained unbroken. The same impulse that once inspired a hunter to carve a figure from bone now drives artists to paint canvases and engineers to build spacecraft. The foundation of human culture, music, stories, rituals, inventions all stem from that original spark of imagination. Without it, we might still be simple tool users, surviving day to day, but never dreaming beyond what we see. Language, too, remains at the core of who we are. The birth of speech allowed knowledge to pass through generations, and today it allows billions of people to share ideas across continents in an instant. The storytelling that once took place around a fire has expanded into books, films, and digital networks, but the purpose is the same: to connect us, to carry memory, to give meaning. The legacy of language is not just communication but community, the ability to imagine ourselves as part of something larger than the individual. Another legacy is adaptability. Our ancestors learned to live in forests, deserts, tundras, and coasts, crafting different tools and strategies for each environment. That same adaptability is what allows modern humans to thrive in climates and situations far removed from our evolutionary birthplace. We wear suits to explore the deep sea, build homes in frozen Arctic lands, and even send machines to other planets. This flexibility is not a new invention, it is the inheritance of countless generations who survived by learning, adjusting, and persevering. The legacy also lives in our relationships with one another. Early humans depended on cooperation, sharing food, protecting the young, caring for the sick. These bonds gave them strength, and that need for connection remains. Today, we still seek belonging, whether in families, communities, or nations. We still rely on empathy, trust, and shared identity to hold us together. Even in our most advanced societies, survival is rarely an individual effort. It is the collective that allows us to endure, just as it did for our ancestors huddled around ancient fires. Yet not all legacies are comforting. The same competitive drive that may have helped Homo sapiens survive while other human species vanished also lingers. Our history holds not only cooperation but conflict. Ancient struggles for territory, resources, and survival echo in modern wars and rivalries. The ability to imagine has given us great art and science, but it has also given us weapons of devastating power. The split that made us human gave us the capacity for both creation and destruction, and that duality remains one of the central truths of our existence. There is also the legacy of curiosity. Early humans looked at stars, rivers, and animals and asked questions. They invented myths to explain the unknown, rituals to give order to chaos. That same drive continues in modern science and philosophy. We explore the depths of the ocean, the origins of the universe, and the mysteries of the human mind. The questions have grown more complex, but the impulse is the same: to understand, to seek meaning, to push beyond the visible horizon. Our very bodies carry legacies of the past. In our DNA, we carry traces of Neanderthals and Denisovans, fragments of other humans who once walked beside us. These traces influence how we respond to disease, how we adapt to altitude, even subtle aspects of our biology. We are not purely Homo sapiens, but a tapestry woven from many human threads, shaped by encounters and unions across millennia. This genetic legacy is a reminder that the split was never absolute. The story of humanity is not one of isolation but of mingling, borrowing, and blending. The legacy is also psychological. The fears and instincts of early life still whisper within us. The sudden startle at a sound in the dark, the comfort of firelight, the unease of being alone, these are echoes of an ancient world where predators prowled and survival demanded constant vigilance. Our cravings for food high in fat or sugar reflect times when such nourishment was rare and precious. Even our social behaviors, from loyalty to suspicion of outsiders, carry the imprint of prehistoric survival strategies. But perhaps the most profound legacy is memory, not the memory of individuals, which fades, but the memory of humanity itself. Through culture, we carry forward lessons, stories, and traditions that began long before written history. Rituals of burial, celebrations of birth, songs of courage and sorrow, all of these tie us back to the earliest humans who first sought meaning in the cycle of life and death. When we gather with others, when we tell stories or sing songs, we are participating in something ancient, something that has bound humanity together since the beginning. Reflecting on this legacy also invites humility. We are the only humans left, but not because we were destined to be. Our survival was fragile, dependent on countless chances, choices, and changes. The disappearance of our cousins reminds us that humanity is not a single story but a tapestry of stories, many of which ended before ours continued. Their absence shapes our presence, and their memory lingers in the fragments they left behind. In quiet moments, we might imagine what they would think of us now, of the cities lit at night, of the voices carried across oceans, of the images sent from distant planets. Would they recognize themselves in us? Would they see in our creativity, our struggles, our joys, the same spark that burned in their lives? Perhaps the truest legacy is this continuity, the reminder that we are not separate from them but a continuation of their journey. The evolutionary split gave rise to Homo sapiens, but it also gave rise to the question of what it means to be human. That question remains with us still, unanswerable, and yet ever present. Each generation must ask it anew, finding meaning in the balance between survival and imagination, between conflict and cooperation, between fragility and resilience. And so, as we close this reflection, we recognize that the split was not the end of a story but the beginning of one. Its legacy is written not only in bones and artifacts but in every thought, every word, every dream we hold. It is a legacy that shapes the world we live in and the worlds we continue to imagine, carrying forward the spark that made us different and, in the deepest sense, made us human. As we come to the end of this long journey through deep time, we are left with a profound sense of both wonder and humility. The evolutionary split that made us different from all other humans was not a single event, like a line drawn sharply in the sand. It was a process, stretched across countless generations, shaped by climate, by chance, by cooperation, and by imagination. And yet, somewhere within that vast stretch of time, something emerged that would change the fate of the world forever, a spark that set Homo sapiens apart. We have followed that spark from the earliest beginnings, when small bands of humans wandered the African landscape, through the moments of survival, contact, and creativity that defined our species. We have reflected on the mysteries that remain unsolved, and we have considered the legacies that still live within us today. Now, as we step back to see the story in its entirety, it becomes clear that the split was not only about difference, it was about possibility. Homo sapiens became the storytellers, the dreamers, the inventors. We learned not only to survive but to imagine futures that did not yet exist, to create tools and symbols that carried meaning beyond the present moment. That ability has allowed us to build civilizations, to explore the depths of the oceans, to map the stars, and even to question our own place in the cosmos. And yet, for all our achievements, the memory of what came before lingers like an echo. The Neanderthals, the Denisovans, the many other branches of humanity that once walked beside us, they remind us that we are not the inevitable center of history, but one outcome among many. This realization can be grounding. It softens the illusion of permanence and instead reveals the fragility of survival. For much of our past, the future of Homo sapiens was uncertain. We, too, could have disappeared. But we did not. We endured, and in enduring, we inherited both the gifts and the burdens of humanity. The capacity for love and art, but also the capacity for conflict and destruction. To be human is to carry both sides of that legacy. There is also a gentleness in this story, a reminder that what truly set us apart was not dominance or strength alone, but connection. The fireside gatherings, the sharing of food, the care for the injured, the rituals of burial and remembrance, these quiet moments of compassion shaped us as much as any tool or weapon. In the end, survival was not only about the individual but about the community. That truth has not changed, even in the modern world. We remain creatures who need one another. And yet, even with all we know, mystery remains. We cannot hear the voices of those who lived so long ago, nor can we fully grasp what they dreamed, feared, or believed. We see their tools, their bones, their paintings on cave walls, but the inner lives of our ancestors are forever beyond reach. This unanswerable mystery is part of what makes the story so endlessly compelling. It invites us to wonder, to imagine, and to reflect on the common humanity that binds us across time. As we close, we might picture one final scene, an ancient fire burning under the stars. Around it, a small group of early humans gathers, telling stories, singing songs, passing down memories that will never be written but will live in the rhythms of their voices. They could not have known that tens of thousands of years later, their descendants would still gather around other kinds of fires, electric lights, glowing screens, still telling stories, still seeking meaning. The form has changed, but the essence remains. The evolutionary split that made us different was not just about survival. It was about becoming beings who remember, who imagine, who ask questions that reach beyond the horizon. That journey continues even now, every time we create, every time we share, every time we pause to wonder at the mystery of life itself. And so, as you rest and reflect on this story tonight, let it bring you a sense of peace. For you are part of this great lineage, connected not only to the people around you but to all who came before. Their struggles, their hopes, their quiet acts of survival live on in you. You are the continuation of a story that began long before written words, a story still unfolding in ways no one can predict. The fire of humanity, once small and fragile, still burns. Its light reaches across millennia, illuminating the past, guiding the present, and pointing us toward futures yet to be imagined. And as you drift into sleep, let that light remind you that you, too, are part of this vast, timeless journey, a journey shaped by the split that made us human, and by the enduring spark that makes us dream. In the quiet of the night, as we step away from the long arc of human history, it is worth pausing for one last reflection. The evolutionary split that set Homo sapiens apart is not simply a scientific curiosity, nor only a question for scholars and researchers. It is, in many ways, a deeply personal story, for it is the story of us. Every heartbeat, every thought, every dream we hold tonight is shaped by that ancient divide. Without it, none of what we know as human life would exist. Picture, if you will, the deep past, an ancient world of shifting climates, vast herds of animals, and scattered groups of humans moving quietly across the land. Among them were many species, some stronger, some more physically resilient, some well adapted to the cold or the mountains. And yet, over time, they disappeared, leaving only one branch to continue the journey. That branch was us. And from those fragile beginnings, a story unfolded that would carry forward across millennia. The epilogue to this journey is not about answers, but about perspective. We often see ourselves as separate from the past, as modern beings standing far from the world of caves and stone tools. But in truth, the distance is not so great. The blood that flows through us is the same blood that once flowed through them. The spark of imagination that allows us to dream was first lit in their minds. And the need for warmth, for community, for safety in the dark, these are not modern inventions, but ancient legacies we still carry. There is also something humbling in recognizing that we are the last of many. For millions of years, the earth was home to more than one kind of human. Neanderthals, Denisovans, and others now lost walked their own paths. Their stories ended, but fragments remain, a strand of DNA in our cells, a tool buried in soil, a painting hidden in stone. They are silent companions to our journey, reminders that we are not alone in our origins. When we think of humanity, we should remember them too, for their presence shaped us as much as our own struggles did. And yet, the epilogue is also a celebration. For out of that split came everything we now hold dear. Language, art, science, music, memory, all were born from the same spark that separated us from the others. Every song sung, every story told, every question asked is part of that inheritance. To be human is to carry forward not only the burden of survival but the gift of imagination. It is to take what was once fragile and uncertain and transform it into something lasting and beautiful. In moments of stillness, when the noise of the world fades, we can almost sense this connection. The same stars that guided our ancestors still shine overhead. The same rhythms of night and day, of seasons passing, still mark our lives. We are tied to the earth, to time itself, in a way that stretches back beyond memory. And this continuity offers comfort, a reminder that we are part of something vast, something enduring. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this story is that difference and fragility need not be barriers. Our survival was never guaranteed, and yet, through cooperation, through curiosity, through resilience, we endured. That truth offers hope even now, in a modern world filled with challenges. The same qualities that once kept small groups alive in a dangerous wilderness remain within us, ready to be called upon when needed. And so, as we close this reflection, imagine again the firelight of ancient times. A group of humans, weary from the day's hunt, gather close. They share warmth, they share food, they share words that will echo through generations. They do not know the future that awaits, nor could they imagine the world we live in now. But in their gathering lies the essence of humanity, connection, imagination, endurance. That essence has carried forward, unbroken, to this very moment. As you drift into sleep, carry with you the thought that you are part of this endless story. Your breath, your heartbeat, your quiet dreams tonight are the continuation of something ancient and extraordinary. The evolutionary split that once seemed so distant is alive within you. It is the reason you can think, love, create, and wonder. It is the reason you can imagine futures beyond the horizon. The epilogue, then, is not an ending. It is a gentle reminder that the story continues, in us, in those who come after us, and in the mysteries still waiting to be discovered. The fire of humanity still burns, and as the night deepens, its glow rests quietly in your hands, lighting not only the past but the dreams of tomorrow.